Alright, captains, I'm going to be honest with you. I don't quite understand what the Yamato Starter Deck is trying to do. For those of you who don't know, there's a new starter deck coming out soon, Mono Yellow Yamato, which features a lot more yellow cards, but now in the land of Wano country flavor, as opposed to the Big Mom flavor we were using. But just because I don't understand it doesn't mean it's not a good deck, right? So let's actually talk about it, let's discover together what exactly does Yamato do, what does this deck do. In order to break it down, I am going to go over what comes in the box itself, including all the ratios for a single starter deck box, some of the key cards that I think are going to be most important in the current meta. I'm going to show you my own sort of customized version of the deck using Yamato as a leader, but with all of the cards that are available up until OP03, and then ultimately whether or not it's a good buy. So Yamato, Mono Yellow, 5000 power, 5 life, and has the ability Dawn ×1 on opponent's turn. When your life area has 2 or less cards, this leader gains 1000 power. So essentially once you hit the 2 life mark, and as long as you have a Dawn onto Yamato, they have plus 1k, so they're a 6000 power leader for your opponent. And if you've played against enough Whitebeard, you know how funky that makes the battle math. This is a bit of a risk reward, as you kind of see with yellow, because it does require you to be at 2 life, which is, admittingly a bit of a risky play, but it does allow you to get a little bit more defense. But is it worth it? If you build it correctly, yes. How is it with this current deck? I'm actually not sure. Next up, we do have 4 copies of Shinobu, and this is a 3 cost to play, 2000 power, no counter, but it has a blocker keyword, and on block you can add 1 card from top or bottom of your life area to your hand, and then this character gains plus 4000 power during the battle. So essentially it becomes a 6k blocker. Next up, we do have our 2k counter. This is character Yamato, so 3 cost to play, 3000 power, counter plus 2k. When attacking, you may add the top or bottom of your life to your hand, and then this character gains plus 2000 power until the start of your next turn. Once again, you have that sort of risk reward, add something to your life, get closer to activating Yamato, your leader's ability, and it does stay until next turn, so it's 5k even for your opponent, but most likely you're going to just want to use it as a 2k counter. Next up, we have Momonosuke, 2 cost to play, 4000 power, counter plus 1k. It is a vanilla card. Next up, Omusubi, so 3 cost to play, 4000 power, counter plus 1k, but does have the trigger ability on trigger, KO up to one of your opponent's characters with a cost of 1 or less, and then add this card to your hand. So this has the benefit of actually having an ability to KO something that's pretty cheap on your opponent's board, while also being able to go into your hand, which is kind of nice. And I believe it is the first time we've seen trigger abilities like this, and so if that becomes a theme for Land of Wano Yellow, honestly, not that bad. Next up, 4 copies of the Monkey D. Luffy, 3 cost to play, 5000 power, counter plus 1k, vanilla. Natural attacker, 5000, except for Whitebeard. It's a vanilla card. Azuki Tempura, 4 cost to play, 5000 power, counter plus 1k. It does have a trigger ability, rest up to one of your opponent's characters with a cost of 2 or less, and then add this card to your hand. So once again, a little bit of extra utility. We can have it as a counter, while also resting one of your opponent's characters. Next up is Kaido, 4 cost to play, 5000 power, counter plus 1k, but Dawn ×1. When you have 2 cards or less in your life area, this character cannot be KO'd by battle, which is interesting because you'd probably want to put onto the board and start swinging with it, while also trying to get your Yamato leader's life down to 2. A bit of a risk reward there. Next up is Ulti, 4 cost to play, 6000 power, counter plus 1k, vanilla. I gotta say, and I didn't stop at Ulti specifically, but I do appreciate the artwork on all of the Yamato cards, even with the Luffy cards that I talked about in the last video. This is a fantastic card. I just wish the abilities were better. Although speaking of good abilities, next up is Ushimaru, 5 cost to play, 6000 power, no counter, which is a little bit of a bummer, but Dawn ×1 when attacking. You can add the top or bottom card of your life area to your hand, play up to 1 yellow Land of Wano type character with a cost of 4 or less from your hand. So I imagine off this play, if you want to go defensive, you're really targeting your Shinobu. If you want to go more offensive, which is kind of how I like it, play one of your standard attackers. Next up is the character of Yamato. 5 cost to play, 7,000 power, so pretty good stat line. Counter plus 1k is a vanilla, but once again, fantastic art. And then going into our super rares, we have Ace, 6 cost to play, 7,000 power. But once per turn, if this character would be KO'd, you can trash 1 card from top or bottom of your life area instead. So essentially your ace just gets to stay on the board, which allows you ideally to apply a lot of pressure on subsequent turns. And then the super rare that I'm personally a little bit more interested in is a Kazuki Odin. So 7 cost to play, 7,000 power. But on ×1, this character gains double attack, but on KO, you can trash 2 cards from your hand to add up to 1 card from top of your deck to top of your life area. So it allows for that sort of pure healing at the cost of 2 cards from your hand, which is tough because yellow also doesn't have a lot of card draw. So those 2 cards, you kind of feel it, right? Yeah, and there's no yellow Land of Wano Searcher, so it is a little bit hard to try and find ways to get those extra resources, right? And then going into the events, we do have 2 copies of the Narikabura Arrow. So this is 1 cost to play, counter event. If you have 2 or less cards in your life area, give up to one of your opponent's leaders or characters minus 3,000 power during this turn. And trigger, you can actually trash 2 cards from your hand to heal yourself essentially. Place top card of deck into top of life. Similar to the Odin effect and similar to Ikaku Sovereignty for those who have been playing yellow. Now this is especially good because it is for the turn. So if you have like restanding leaders such as Lucci, such as Kid, this could be effective on them. Or if you're playing against the law, you can target one of the numerous supernovas that they're probably going to try and restand on the next play, So I think there is a lot of use case, and I think this is arguably one of the most valuable cards in this starter deck. But it's not the only counter event, because we also do have 4 copies of Thunder Bagua. 2 cost to play, counter up to one of your leader or characters, gains plus 4,000 power during this battle. Then, if you have 2 or less cards in your life area, place up to one of your opponent's characters with a cost of 3 or less at the top or bottom of their life, face down. It does have the nice trigger ability of draw 1, so that's where we get a little bit of that extra draw, and that it becomes, and that it comes as a 4 of is actually pretty nice. But with all that out of the way, what are the most meta-relevant cards in the starter deck? To be honest, it's probably the Narikabura Arrow, as well as the 2k Yamato counter. That's it. I think part of my hesitation with this is that we just don't have enough Land of Wano support in yellow to make this a relatively functional deck. All of our Land of Wano stuff has been green. Our Wano Searcher is in green. If this was multicolored, that'd be great, right? And part of me is like, can we make a Wano Arlong build? But also, is that the best way to go about it? I don't know. It's tough, right? And with the deck as it is out of the box, there are a lot of abilities that, favor you taking your own life, putting into your hand. Kind of Whitebeardy in that sense. And that way you can trigger your ability once you go to 2 life. But then you're also playing at 2 life, fairly early on, especially if you try and play a lot of these effects early. And it feels like the deck wants you to be aggressive like that. But my personal stance would have been to lean more defensive, right? Defend as much as I possibly can. And if I have to lose life, I have to lose life, right? But fill my deck with triggers, fill it with counter events and, 2k counters, and then try and wait it out until I get to my big stuff, like my Odin, maybe some other characters, and then prosper in the late game as yellow wants to do. And if you want to see like a sample of what that might look like, here is a sample deck list that I built with that sort of philosophy in mind. And you can see we did add a bunch of triggers. The other thing that I really wanted to add was what I call life cyclers. So Sanji and Daifuku from the starter deck. And those are things where you can, grab the top or bottom of your life, but then add one from top of your deck to replace it. And if you're going second, you can do that as early as turn 2 with Sanji, as long as you put 2 Dawn onto him. But just to go over the full list entirely, we do have our Yamato leader, 3 copies of Shirahoshi, just because she would allow us to get the card draw if we're able to get her out of life. If she's in our hand, then we can use her as counters. 4 copies of Streusen. I think he's a really good 2k counter that if you're playing against something like a Zoro that's still playing the 1 cost characters or Law, you can use his effect to essentially KO some of those 1 costs that aren't going to be necessarily swinging into you. 4 copies of Brûlée, mostly because she's a blocker and she can trigger from life. 4 copies of Pudding, because we are playing a heavy Big Mom package here, so need our searchers. 4 copies of the 2K Sanji. Like I said, he's a really good life cycler. I did include the 2K counter Yamato, mostly because it comes from a starter deck. It felt thematic to do so. So included Yamato here. Could use the effect, but I honestly would hesitate to do so. Next up, 4 copies of Prospero. Once again, we're playing Big Mom heavy package, so want to have that availability of, having a second searcher essentially. I got 3 copies of Charlotte Cracker, mostly because if we're going to try and get to 2 life, fairly quickly, right, and play in that range, I do want the ability to be able to have double attack and utilize Cracker as he's supposed to be. And plus, he's a great way to kind of get back into the match if your opponent does not have a answer or response to Cracker. 4 copies of Charlotte Daifuku, once again, life cycler, a really good attacker. At Dawn ×1 makes him 6k. I did include 2 copies of Kazuki Odin. I do think double attack is going to be useful for trying to get back into the match. And I do like his on KO ability, being a pure heal, very much like the trigger effects for Arrow and Nikaku Sovereignty. But because he's not my main big body, I only did include 2 of him. If I'm able to draw into him, great. If not, I'm not really, fussing about it. Now, what makes this particular deck list a little expensive is I do call for 4 copies of Katakuri. I think Katakuri is very good, even though I only ran 1 in my own personal Big Mom list because I only pulled 1 and didn't want to pay like at the time, $50 for him. He is a very good effect, and if you can, heal yourself by bouncing your own Shirahoshi into life, I think that's really good, just because once again, we want a little bit more card draw. And then this is pretty event heavy, so maybe a little too heavy, but thus far, in my playtesting, it's been fair. 2 copies of Narikabura Arrow, which is that counter event that does the minus 3k power for the turn. Then we do have 3 copies of Kaku Sovereignty, just a really good card. 2 costs to play, counter, plus 5k for your leader or your characters. And both of them have the same trigger ability, where you can trash 2 cards from your hand and then place 1 card from the top of your deck to the top of your life. I do have 3 copies of Thunderbolt, mostly because I think it's a necessity for any yellow deck, especially in this meta with all your really dangerous 5-cost characters just running rampant in the meta. If you want, you can go to 4, but I was thinking it was too event heavy already. And then I do have 2 copies of Soul Focus, right? Like I said before, I don't want to go to 2 so quickly. So if I can, activate a Soul Focus relatively early, get some of that heal, so I can kind of stay afloat while I try and find some of my bigger pieces, and then start playing more defensively, I think this is a good inclusion. But overall, as looking into OP03 meta, the cards we have available, I don't necessarily see the synergy with Yamato. And unfortunately, I think that makes Yamato one of the weaker mono yellow leaders we have. Now, I do think that the leader will improve as we get more cards, as we get more Wano Country yellow support, which is coming in OP04, small spoiler. But I do think it's necessary. Will it change the power scale of the leader? I don't know. I don't think so. So if you were to ask me the question, is it worth picking up the deck? I think if I can find it at my local game store for a good price, I'm gonna pick up 2 of them, right? But also, I make One Piece content, I play yellow, and I am curious about the deck to try it on a fun level, but I'm in no rush to pick it up. And if you feel the same way, don't feel pressured to pick it up. Let it be a happy accident, a fun surprise. One of those times when you go to the store, you see it on the shelf, and you're like, you know what, today, I think I'm gonna treat myself. But yeah, don't spend 20 bucks on it, please. Now, I know that was a bit of a harsh review of the starter deck, but if you wanted to see my thoughts on the other starter deck that's coming out with it, check out this video over here.